Hi, I'm Phil Hubbard. I'm Professor of Urban Studies at King's College London, and usually I write on housing and gentrification issues in British cities. But in my latest book, Borderland, I jump scale to start thinking about the meaning and identity of a whole region, and that's the East Kent coastal region, that area of southeast England that directly faces continental Europe. And my book offers a reading of that landscape that is part geological, part ecological, part social, part political. And overall, it argues that this highly symbolic landscape is really important, not just for marking the distinction between land and sea, but marking a boundary between a particular sense of Englishness that is often opposed to a particular sense of European identity, an issue that's been much discussed in the last 5 or so years. So a key argument in the book is that the landscape of East Kent has been indelibly shaped in a number of ways by the relationship that exists between England and continental Europe. And that we can think about that as the result of episodes in which Europe has been drawn closer to or pushed further away from England. And here we might be thinking about Brexit as yet just one of a series of episodes that has fundamentally changed this cultural, social and economic relationship between England and Europe in ways that we can see manifest in the landscape of the Kent coast. And because of this relationship and the position of Kent between England and Europe, in a sense, on the border, its landscapes have become incredibly important, I would argue, in the construction of a particular idea of Englishness. And the idea of the island nation is something which is understood to be propped up by representations of things like the White Cliffs of Dover. But more than that, all the way along the Kent coast, we see the remnants of former periods of conflict where Kent was the front line against the imagined threat of overseas forces, be that Napoleon's time or, more recently, the German aggression in World War I and II. Kent today is not a heavily militarised landscape, and it clearly hasn't seen conflict for many decades, yet it's still a landscape that evokes the past and military history through a series of memorials and monuments to past military sacrifices. And there's an almost coercive sense of remembrance which is writ large in the Kent landscape, which I discuss in my book. And in my book I argue that this particular mythology of Kent as the front line, as a defensive bastion against foreign invasion, is really important in relation to another great myth about Kent, and that's the myth that it's the Garden of England. That land, that rich, verdant landscape between London and the coast, the larder of London as it was often called, which is symbolised and known through myths of rolling countryside, of hops, of cider, of cherries, and of course the quintessential symbol of Kent rural identity, the Oast House that we see here. And I'd argue that this mythology about Kent as the Garden of England is still really important in propping up a particular sense of national identity, in so much that Englishness seems to be an idea that is often mapped onto the landscapes of southern rural England. And that's something of a contradiction because, of course, Kent today is not a particularly rural county, and much of the north and the west of the county merges into London in this kind of inchoate borderland of warehousing, industrial premises, and dull commuter housing. So my book's not really just about the relationship between Kent and Europe, it's about the relationship between England and Europe as it's mediated through the Kent coast. And that gets us thinking about London in particular as the seat of power and the way that Kent mediates the relationship between London and Europe. And here that gets me thinking about things like the movement of Londoners down to coastal communities, particularly places like Whitstable, which have become a real haven for foodies, for day trippers and tourists who come down from London to experience a particular authentic slice of coastal life, very much oriented around the consumption of food and drink. Margate too is a place that we understand, whose identity has been heavily shaped by its relationship with London. Generations of day trippers from the East End in particular producing this identity of the bucket and spade tourism that began to decline quite disastrously in the 70s and 80s, leaving Margate with a legacy of social problems and seasonal unemployment. But as I explain in the book, Margate is a place that's changed quite rapidly in recent years. It's become markedly more cosmopolitan as it switched away from predominantly white working class versions of tourist identity. And it's a town that's benefited from the so-called Turner effect and the legacy of the Turner Gallery in producing a kind of artful form of gentrification that's appealed to a particular type of gentrifiers from London. So in my book, I'm trying to think about the changing identity of Kent coastal towns like Dover, Folkestone and Margate in particular, that were often depicted in the press as bastions of a particular type of white Englishness. Communities that were seen to be quite pro-Brexit despite their proximity to Europe. Elsewhere in the book, I tend to think about the imprints of Brexit itself. Most obviously, perhaps, in the construction of new inland border facilities such as this one near Ashford, which have been built to accommodate the lorries and the freight travelling through that is required to fulfil new custom checks in the wake of the separation from Europe. And in a sense, I suppose, what I'm doing in the book is beginning to think about the costs of Brexit in terms of some of the unwelcome infrastructure that local people have had to put up with. And here I'm particularly reflecting on the Sevington Inland Border Facility, built adjacent to the village where I grew up and my mother still lives. A facility where as many as 10,000 lorries a day were predicted to be coming post-Brexit, arising all sorts of local fears about the post-Brexit settlement and the impact on the county. And in December 2020, some of those fears were realised as we saw upwards of 4,000 lorries stranded on Kentish motorways and car parks while lorry drivers were waiting to get back to the continent for Christmas because the French had closed the border because of the outbreak of the Kentish variant of COVID. So layered upon these kind of images of the Kent as the Garden of England, we also have more dystopian images in the recent past of lorry drivers stranded, away from home, living on meagre rations and provided with inadequate facilities and parking, leading to new kind of discourses of blockage and despoilment and this new motif, welcome to Kent, the toilet of England. So Kent has hardly been out of the news since the Brexit referendum in 2016, and we presented with a series of rather contradictory images. On the one hand, dystopian images of lorry drivers trying to get home, but thwarted by disruption and delay. But on the other hand, we've seen images of people trying to get into the country, the so-called crisis of the border, as manifest in the arrival of refugees and asylum seekers at the Kent coast, here represented in an image of dinghies stacked up at a warehouse just outside Dover. And it's the arrival of asylum seekers and refugees in Kent that has aroused quite strong passions. On the one hand, we have people extending the hand of welcome, extending Kentish hospitality to these visitors. But on the other hand, we see exclusionary nationalisms and racism, the creation of a hostile environment. And nowhere is this more exemplified, I think, than at Shorncliffe Barracks in Folkestone, once the First World War staging posts for the army going to the Western Front, but now a grim holding camp for asylum seekers that has been judged as inhumane and unsuitable, but was nonetheless used for large numbers of asylum seekers, many of whom have been fleeing warfare overseas. At the other end of Folkestone, above Sunny Sands, we have Cornelia Parker's statue of the Folkestone Mermaid, a really famous piece of local public art tied into the Biennale. And one could look at that and think that the mermaid is looking out to sea, concerned about foreign invaders, asylum seekers, refugees, but that's not the intention of this piece of art. It's actually about climate change and sea level change. And in the book, I suggest that the key existential threat to the Kent coast is, of course, not the influx of migrants from overseas, but the very real existential threat of climate change. The famous White Cliffs of Dover, for example, are receding at a rate of around 20 centimetres a year, largely unchallenged. And a very major cliff collapse in February 2021 was interpreted by Remainers as some kind of symbolic statement about the impact of Brexit on Britain. And in low-lying parts of Kent, such as Romney Marsh and at its southeast tip, Dungeness, sea level change would be absolutely catastrophic. Even more so at Dungeness, because it's host to 2 nuclear power stations, and after the 2014 Fukushima disaster, these were taken out of service for urgent upgrading and repair, given they were seen to be more susceptible to flood risk than had ever been the case before. And I finish my book at Dungeness, at the southeast tip of Kent, and I end at Derek Jarman's garden. Jarman, of course, a famous AIDS activist, artist and filmmaker, whose garden represents a unique contribution to our understanding of modern nature, open to the elements, open to otherness, a very different sense of identity and belonging that is often expressed at the coast in the form of an exclusionary nationalism. So Borderland is superficially a book about Kent, but it's a book about much more than that. It's a book about the relationship between Englishness and Europe. It's a book about the dangers of exclusionary nationalism, and it's a book about the importance of reaching out and embracing the other at a time that our lives depend upon it. I hope you enjoy it.